Welcome to Kat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello, I'm Kat, and this is Kat Has Questions. This is part 2 of our Dead Wrong series on the Pam Hupp case. If you haven't listened to the previous episode, I'd recommend starting there because this story builds and is wild. Last week, we left off the night Betsy Faria was killed. The party, the ride home, the discovery, and the way suspicions settled quickly onto her husband, Russ. But tonight isn't about the crime scene. It's about context. Because long before Betsy was killed, a story was already forming around her, and one person was positioned to tell it. Let's get into it. Part 2, The Best Friend. Every criminal case has evidence. Fingerprints, timelines, physical facts that exist whether anyone believes it or not. But evidence alone doesn't solve cases. People do. People decide what matters. People decide who feels credible. People decide whose voice gets amplified and whose questions get dismissed. In this case, one voice mattered more than any other. And this is the story of how Pamela Hupp became the most trusted person in the room. From the earliest hours of the investigation, her interpretation of events was documented, repeated, and eventually treated as foundational context rather than testimony to be tested. So who was Pam Hupp? Pam wasn't a stranger who appeared out of nowhere after Betsy's death. She was already there. She had worked with Betsy. They knew each other well enough to share rides, spend time together, and talk regularly. They became friends. According to coworkers interviewed after Betsy's death, Pamela was often described as attentive, organized, and closely involved in the lives of people around her. Betsy and Pam first met many years before 2011, when they both worked at an insurance office in Missouri. Their acquaintance goes back to at least the early 2000s. So Pam was born Pamela Marie Newman. She was born December 22nd, 1958, in Missouri. She primarily grew up in the St. Louis area. She grew up in a middle-class family in a Midwestern upbringing. There's no public record of extreme poverty, abuse, or criminal behavior in her childhood. By all outward appearances, Pam grew up in a fairly ordinary environment. People who knew Pam early in life, including coworkers, acquaintances, consistently described traits that appeared to have been present long before adulthood. As a young person, Pam was described as needing to be the center of attention. She would become upset when she felt ignored or excluded, and wanted to be seen as important or special. These traits definitely do not mean someone will become violent, but they are often noted in hindsight because they line up with her later behavior in life. Several sources note that Pam had a tendency to embellish stories, often portrayed herself as either a hero or a victim, and would dramatize events to gain sympathy and admiration. Again, this pattern is mostly reconstructed from later life behavior, but people who knew her look back on this and say that it wasn't new. It's something that she'd always done. Also from an early age, Pam wanted to be seen as responsible, helpful, and kind of smarter or more capable than others. This later showed up in adulthood as her inserting herself deeply into other people's crises, illnesses, legal problems, family issues, positioning herself as the only person who could help in that situation. And the family dynamics she grew up in are important to kind of take into context, but there is no verified evidence that Pam Hupp grew up in like an abusive home, that she was like neglected, or like there was any sort of extreme dysfunction in her life. This absence stands out because many violent offenders do have well-documented traumatic childhoods, but Pam's background instead appears relatively stable, which makes her later actions more chilling to many investigators. By her late teens and early 20s, Pam was described as socially functional. She married, worked, and blended into everyday life. She learned how to present herself as trustworthy and maternal. This period seems to be where her manipulative skills sharpened, understanding how to read people, gain trust, and use sympathy to her advantage. While no clinician evaluated her as a child, at least publicly that we know of, experts looking back on her life point to some long-standing narcissistic traits, a little bit of pathological lying tendencies, a lack of genuine empathy masked by performative caregiving, and comfort with deception, even when consequences were severe for others. These traits don't just suddenly appear in middle age. They tend to develop early, even if they don't become violent until much later. And there are two main reasons we don't have dramatic childhood stories about Pam. She blended in. She wasn't disruptive enough to draw attention or intervention. Her harm came much later and much quieter. She didn't act out violently. Her danger began to show up when she had access to vulnerable people, financial incentives, and opportunities to manipulate the systems. Pam in her young life was raised by both parents, as I mentioned, working to middle-class family, and all of their names, occupations, and personal histories are not really publicly detailed in court or major reportings. And this lack of detail is unusual in high-profile cases, but it strongly suggests that her parents were not criminally involved, they were not abusive in a way that would have triggered official intervention, and they did not seek publicity during Pam's trial or investigation. No credible source has ever described her parents as violent, neglectful, or dysfunctional. So as far as siblings go, there's no confirmed public record clearly identifying siblings. If she had siblings, they remained completely out of public view. There were no interviews, victim statements, or media appearances from siblings. And that silence is telling. In cases with family trauma or abuse, siblings often surface later, and here they just simply don't. While we don't have names and anecdotes, investigators and journalists have commented on the patterns that likely originated from her family environment. So the appearance of normalcy mattered. So she probably grew up in a home where looking normal and respectable was important, and problems were likely handled just at home, not publicly. By most accounts, Pam was dependable, the kind of person who showed up, who remembered details. She wasn't chaotic, she wasn't dramatic, she was steady. People often defer to the person who seems the most certain, the person who speaks confidently, the person who sounds like they know what's going on, and Pam fit that role naturally. She wasn't just around Betsy. She became someone people associated with Betsy's inner world, her moods, her fears, her private thoughts. In investigative terms, this placed Pam in a position of narrative proximity, close enough to speak with confidence, but without the need to corroborate her perspective. And that matters more than it might sound, because in investigations, proximity doesn't just provide access, it provides power. As Pam's involvement in Betsy's life increased, so did her credibility. Caretaking has a kind of built-in trust. If someone is helping, driving, assisting, and advocating, we tend to assume their intentions are good. Caretakers are rarely questioned first. They're appreciated, relied on, and sometimes even admired. Pam accompanied Betsy to places. She helped manage parts of Betsy's daily life, and she spoke confidently about Betsy's emotional state. In her statements to investigators, Pam described her relationship with Betsy as unusually close. Not just coworkers or friends, but confidants. She characterized herself as someone Betsy trusted deeply, and someone that Betsy confided privately about her fears, her marriage, and her plans for the future. This description of intimacy appears repeatedly early in investigative summaries, positioning Pam as the person who understood Betsy better than anyone else. In interviews with police, Pam said Betsy trusted her. Over time, the dynamic shifts. It's subtle. The caretaker stops being one voice among many and becomes the voice, the person who, quote-unquote, knows, and the person who can explain things others can't see. This isn't unusual. It's human. We trust the people closest to us to tell the truth, especially when the truth is complicated or uncomfortable. After Betsy's death, investigators needed context. They needed motive. They needed to understand the emotional landscape of Betsy's life. Pam provided it to police. She told police that Betsy had been afraid, that she'd confided in her, and that she was planning to leave her husband. Statements like these are powerful because they're hard to challenge. When someone says, "She told me," there's no way to fact-check it, no document to verify, no witness to cross-examine. It became an emotional truth rather than an evidentiary one. And emotional truths are persuasive. They give meaning to violence, they turn chaos into narrative. They explain why something awful makes sense. Once investigators accepted Pam's interpretation of Betsy's inner life, everything else began to align around it. The crime wasn't just violent, it was personal. The marriage wasn't just imperfect, it was dangerous. And Russ wasn't just the husband, he became the explanation. In criminal investigations, motive often fills the gaps that evidence can't. If you know why something happened, you don't always feel the need to know how it happened in detail. Pam's statements gave investigators a ready-made motive. They fit into a familiar framework: troubled marriage, private fear, and a final confrontation. At this stage of the investigation, these contextual elements began to appear alongside physical evidence in reports. It wasn't that police ignored evidence. It's that the evidence was filtered through this lens or a story that already felt complete. Confirmation bias doesn't feel like bias in the moment. It feels like clarity. Every new detail gets interpreted through that same lens, and anything that doesn't fit quietly fades into the background. Pam's role in shaping that lens went largely unquestioned. She wasn't treated as someone who benefit from the narrative. She was treated as someone helping authorities understand it. So Pam was never seriously scrutinized during this time. Her proximity wasn't reframed as opportunity, even though she was the last person to see Betsy alive. That fact, while documented, was not initially treated as an investigative risk. Her confidence wasn't read as control. She just seemed like she was a credible witness, a trusted one to police. Because Pam's version of events became the foundation, challenging it meant unraveling the entire case. It meant admitting that early assumptions might be wrong, that the wrong questions were asked and the wrong things were latched onto. So instead, the story solidified, Pam testified, and her words became evidence. And by the time the case went to trial, there was very little room for doubt. By the time the jury heard this case, Pam Hupp wasn't just a witness. She was the emotional backbone of the prosecution's story. She explained fear, she explained violence, and with her testimony, the case against Russ Faria finally felt complete. But if you thought this case was straightforward, it's not. What if I were to tell you that Betsy was already dying and that her life insurance policy was changed 4 days before she died? Next week, when we start pulling at the threads, you're going to see just how much hiding there was in plain sight. Next time, the man they said did it. Until then, stay curious. Sources for this episode are listed in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.